The egg is smaller than you might expect, barely the size of a grapefruit, its shell no thicker than a coin. And yet somewhere inside that fragile curve of calcium, something extraordinary is taking shape. In a few weeks, if it survives, it could grow into an animal that shakes the ground when it walks. But right now, it is blind, folded, and utterly helpless. And that contradiction, the giant that begins as almost nothing, hides one of the strangest questions in all of paleontology. What did the rulers of the Mesozoic actually look like at the very start of their lives? And what was it like to open your eyes for the first time in a world ruled by monsters? For most of the history of my field, we simply had no idea. We built our image of dinosaurs from enormous adult skeletons, the towering necks, the crushing jaws, the horns and armor. But almost nobody ever found the young ones. And for a long time, that absence created a quiet assumption that these were animals born already fierce, already formidable, miniature versions of their parents, dropped into the world ready to fight. The truth, as it turned out, was far stranger, far more tender, and in some cases, almost unrecognizable. The breakthrough came in the late 1970s in the Badlands of Montana, when a small collection of tiny bones was pulled from the rock. They belonged to babies, not eggs alone, not fragments, but the delicate remains of hatchlings clustered together in what could only be described as a nest. The animal was named
And yet, their legs were underdeveloped, too weak to carry them far from the nest. Think about what that means. These infants could not feed themselves, but they were being fed. Something was bringing food back to the nest. Something was staying. And here is where I have to be honest about how science actually works, because it would be easy to turn that single discovery into a fairy tale. Not everyone agreed. Some argued the leg bones only looked immature, that these babies might have been more capable than they seemed. The debate ran for years, but more nests emerged, more clusters of the very young found in the same arrangement, and the weight of the evidence slowly settled. At least some dinosaurs cared for their offspring in ways we once reserved only for birds and mammals. The image of the cold, solitary reptile was quietly dissolving. If you're the kind of person who feels that pull, the desire to know what these creatures were really like, not the movie version, but the real animal, then consider joining these expeditions into the deep past. There's a new one waiting every week, and the mysteries only get stranger from here. But let's return to the nest, because the biggest surprises are still ahead. To understand a baby dinosaur, you have to understand just how small some of them began. Among the sauropods, the long-necked giants, the largest animals ever to walk the earth, the gap between hatchling and adult is almost impossible to imagine. An adult could weigh as much as a dozen elephants. Its baby could fit in your hands. In Argentina, at a site called Aucamahueva,
unborn dinosaurs curled in the dark, preserved for 80 million years, and pressed into the rock beside them were impressions of their skin, tiny scales, patterns, the texture of an animal that never took its first breath. And then there is the question of what those newborns could actually sense. A hatchling's world was not the world of its parents. Down at ground level, among the ferns and the leaf litter, a baby dinosaur lived in a landscape of shadows and smells, of sounds it may only slowly have learned to read. We can study the shape of the brain case, the size of the eye sockets, the delicate structures of the inner ear, and from them we can begin to guess at how sharp their vision was, how well they heard, whether they were built for the bright of day or the safety of dusk. The answers differ from species to species, and for many of them we are still guessing. But it's worth pausing on the strangeness of it, that the same senses which made an adult a fearsome hunter had to be learned, tested, and survived first by something small enough to be swallowed whole. Those hatchlings emerged into a world that had no interest in protecting them. A baby sauropod was a walking meal for almost everything around it. And it was not only sauropods facing those odds. At one remarkable site, an adult plant-eating dinosaur was found preserved alongside dozens of its young, all huddled together in a single group. A snapshot, frozen in stone, of the young sheltering close in numbers, as if there were safety in staying together. And this is where scientists face one of the great unanswered questions. How did any of them survive? Some suspect the answer lies in sheer numbers, hundreds of eggs laid so that a handful might live.
Others wonder whether the young hid in dense forest, growing at a furious pace, racing to reach a size where predators could no longer bother them. What we do know is that they grew astonishingly fast, their bones recording the sprint like rings in a tree. But whether their mothers ever looked back, whether the giants offered any protection at all, remains genuinely uncertain. The rock has not given us that answer yet. Now here is the revelation I've been saving, and it's the one that changed how I see these animals entirely. We tend to assume a baby dinosaur was simply a smaller copy of the adult. It wasn't. In many species, the young looked so different that for decades we mistook them for entirely separate kinds of animal. Consider Triceratops, with its vast frill and 3 enormous horns. Its babies had almost none of that. Their horns curved in the opposite direction, their frills were small, their faces round and short. As they grew, their skulls transformed so dramatically that the horns rotated, the frill expanded, the whole architecture of the head rebuilt itself. And this pattern appears again and again. Some skulls, once catalogued as unique species, now appear to be nothing more than teenagers, the same animal caught in the middle of becoming itself. There are still fierce arguments over exactly which fossils are separate species and which are just growth stages, and those debates are far from settled. But the deeper lesson is clear. To grow up as a dinosaur was to be transformed, sometimes almost beyond recognition. And they may have been softer than we imagined, too. Look closely at the smaller, meat-eating dinosaurs and their relatives, and a picture emerges of hatchlings covered 9 scales.
Even the ancestors and young of the great predators may have worn a coat of primitive feathers, insulation for a small body that lost heat quickly, and perhaps, in some species, a splash of color. The infant of an animal we picture as a scaled killer might have looked more like an awkward, fluffy chick stumbling through the undergrowth. I find that almost impossible to hold in my mind alongside the adult, and that gap between the two is exactly what makes this so haunting. There is one more thing about baby dinosaurs that I can't stop thinking about, and it isn't really about bones at all. It's about their faces. If you look at the reconstructed skull of a hatchling, the large eyes, the short snout, the rounded head, you are looking at something our own brains are wired to respond to. Those are the same proportions that make a puppy, a kitten, a human infant pull at something deep inside us. Biologists have a name for it, and they see it across the animal kingdom. And it raises a question we can barely begin to answer. If a baby dinosaur triggered that same instinct in its parents, if the sight of those wide eyes made an adult more likely to guard the nest, to bring food, to stay, then something we think of as tender and modern may be far, far older than our species, older than mammals ruling the earth. A thread of care running back into a world we will never see. We have to be careful here, because this is where wonder can outrun evidence. We cannot climb inside the mind of a creature dead for 66 million years. We can't know what an adult Maiasaura felt, or whether it felt anything we would recognize at all. But we can read the nests, we can count the eggs, we can see the worn baby teeth, and the food that must have been carried in the dark.
And from those fragments, a portrait assembles itself, not of monsters, but of animals that were born small, born vulnerable, and in at least some cases, born into the care of something larger than themselves. The more I study these hatchlings, the more the old story falls apart. We inherited an image of dinosaurs as engines of violence, born ready to kill. What the fossils actually show is far more familiar and far more moving. The fragile beginning, the fast and dangerous childhood, the slow transformation into something enormous. A journey not too different in its shape from the one every living thing must make. And somewhere in a Cretaceous nest, beneath a sky none of us will ever stand under, a tiny animal opened its eyes for the first time, blinked at the light, and had absolutely no idea what it would one day become. That, to me, is the real wonder of it. Not the size of the giant, but the smallness of its start. There is another creature I want to take you to next, one whose babies may have hunted in packs before they were even fully grown, coordinating in ways that shouldn't have been possible for a brain that size. The evidence is strange, the theories collide,
and the mystery is only beginning to unravel. So stay with me, and let's go find out what it was really like to grow up inside that mind.